Your parents, your problem. Julian said it the way he'd say the weather was cold. No heat behind it. No hesitation. Just a fact he expected the whole table to accept, the way you accept that the sun sets in the west. I was holding my phone under the tablecloth, my father's text still glowing on the screen. Vic, the bank called again. They want $84,000 by Friday, or they're filing. My hand didn't move. My face didn't move. 22 years in courtrooms teaches you that. We were at the Vance family dining table on Astor Street, the one with the hand-carved mahogany legs that Eleanor liked to mention cost more than most people's cars. Candlelight caught the crystal chandelier overhead, scattering small gold fractures across the white tablecloth. Somewhere in the kitchen, the housekeeper Bartholomew had hired the year before was plating branzino for 4, though none of them ever asked who actually covered her salary. Bartholomew sat at the head of the table, working through his second glass of Barolo, a bottle worth more than my father's monthly grocery bill at the hardware store. Dominic was scrolling through something on his phone, probably the new Porsche configurator, knowing him. And Julian sat across from me, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin like he hadn't just detonated something. I wasn't asking your permission, Julian, I said. I was telling you I'm wiring the money tomorrow morning. With what account, he said and smiled. Not cruel. Worse than cruel, amused. Your salary funds half this house's insurance. You really want to split it 3 ways. Eleanor made a small sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sigh, the sound she'd been perfecting for the 11 years I'd been her daughter-in-law. Bartholomew didn't even look up from his glass. Here is what none of them knew, sitting at that table on the evening of March 3rd. I wasn't just the woman who covered the Peloton membership and the twins' Latin tutor and Eleanor's twice-monthly hair appointments at Sassoon. I was the reason Vance Family Holdings existed at all. 5 years ago, when Bartholomew's original real estate fund collapsed after the Lakeshore Tower deal went sideways, I signed as personal guarantor on a $2.3 million line of credit at First Continental Bank so the family could relaunch under a new name, Vance Premier Properties. My signature, not Julian's, not Bartholomew's, sat on the collateral documents. My W-2, filed every April at Whitfield & Cross, the firm where I made partner at 36, was the only thing that made a Chicago bank comfortable extending that much credit to a man who had already failed once. Julian knew the paperwork existed. He'd signed the spousal consent form himself, half drunk on champagne the night we closed on the Lincoln Park office. But I don't think he'd ever really understood what that consent meant. To him, my signature was a formality, something a wife did, like picking flower arrangements. To First Continental, it was the entire foundation of the loan. I need the funds for my father, I said again, quieter this time. His hardware business has been open since 1987. He's 68 years old and recovering from bypass surgery, and someone put a lien on his equipment 3 weeks ago. And that's terrible, Julian said, and for 1/2 second I almost believed he meant it. But my money is mine, Victoria. Your money is yours. We've never really mixed things, you know that. We had never mixed things. That part was true. What Julian didn't say, what none of them said, not once in 5 years, was that his money and his business were both standing on a credit line that existed only because of me. Dominic finally looked up from his phone. Didn't you get, like, a huge bonus at the firm last quarter? He said it lightly, like he was asking about brunch reservations. Dominic was 29 and had put 4 sports cars on financing in the last 3 years, each one somehow disappearing before the next arrived. I used to wonder how he afforded the lease payments on an assistant property manager's salary. I don't wonder anymore. I'd found the answer 6 weeks earlier, by accident, going through a shared drive at Vance Premier Properties while helping Bartholomew's assistant format a lender presentation. A line item labeled Marketing Consulting, D. Vance LLC, showed $14,000 a month, every month, for 2 straight years. Dominic didn't do marketing. In the time I'd known him, he had never produced a single flyer, brochure, or social post for the company. The money moved from the operating account straight into an LLC he'd quietly registered in Delaware, one he assumed nobody in the family would ever bother to look up. I'd looked it up. I hadn't said anything. Not yet. Eleanor set down her fork. Victoria, darling, we all have obligations. Julian has this family. You understand. I did understand. I understood it better than any of them realized. I finished my wine. I thanked Eleanor for the branzino. I told Julian I had an early deposition and needed to review my notes, which was true. Whitfield and Cross had me on a fraud case involving a supplement company, ironically enough, and I did have notes to review. What I didn't mention was that I intended to review something else first. That night, after Julian fell asleep in front of a Bulls replay, I sat in my home office with my laptop and pulled up the First Continental Credit Facility, document number FC, 2021-0847, executed April 14, 2021. I read through all 31 pages the way I'd read a hostile witness's testimony, looking for the exact clause I already knew was there because I'd drafted the language myself. Section 9.2, C. Guarantor reserves the right to terminate this guarantee upon 60 days written notice to the bank, subject to full repayment or refinancing of outstanding obligations by borrower prior to termination effectiveness. 60 days. I could start the clock right now. But there was a second document, one I'd almost forgotten existed because it had been buried in an amendment from 18 months ago, a personal guarantee modification that Bartholomew had begged me to sign after Vance Premier Properties took on a second, larger project, the Prairie Row luxury condo development, 26 units on Lakeshore Drive, projected to close at $31 million. That amendment had shortened the notice requirement to 30 days, in exchange for me getting a small equity stake I'd never bothered to collect on. Bartholomew's lawyer at the time, not me, a friend of his from the golf club, hadn't caught what that 30-day clause actually meant for construction financing draws. Prairie Row was mid-construction. Draw 6 of 9 was scheduled for March 28. Without my guarantee backing the line, First Continental would freeze every remaining draw the moment my notice took effect. I opened a new email. Not to Julian. Not to Bartholomew. To Marcus Webb, senior counsel at First Continental, the man who had personally underwritten the Vance file 5 years ago, and who had called me directly, more than once, to thank me for how clean and responsive I always was compared to the borrower. Marcus, hope you're well. I need to discuss formally terminating my personal guarantee on Vance Family Holdings / Vance Premier Properties, per Section 9.2, C, of FC, 2021-0847 as modified. Can we set up a call tomorrow at 9 a.m.? I'd like to begin the 30-day notice period immediately. I read it twice. I didn't cry. I didn't feel my hands shake. Julian's voice came back to me, easy and untroubled, the way he'd said it in front of his whole family like it cost him nothing. Your parents, your problem. I pressed send at 11:47 p.m. What Julian didn't know, what he wouldn't find out for another 11 days, until a courier arrived at the Lincoln Park office with a certified letter from First Continental Bank, was that his family's entire luxury lifestyle, the Astor Street house, Dominic's Porsche, Eleanor's Sassoon appointments, all of it, was built on a foundation that I alone had the power to remove. And I had just signed the notice that would remove it. The clock was already running. 30 days. I closed my laptop, walked past Julian asleep on the couch, the Bulls game still glowing blue across his face, and went to bed without waking him. He had no idea what he'd said yes to 5 years ago when he handed me that spousal consent form. He was about to find out exactly what it meant. There was one more thing I hadn't told Marcus Webb in that email, and hadn't told Julian at that dinner table, and wasn't ready to tell anyone yet. 2 days before that dinner, I'd gotten a call from a woman named Renata Cole, a project accountant who'd worked under Bartholomew for 11 months before quitting without notice back in January. She wanted to meet somewhere that wasn't the office. She used the words escrow shortfall and Prairie Row in the same sentence, and then she hung up before I could ask her anything else. I hadn't called her back yet. I planned to first thing in the morning, right after my call with Marcus Webb. Whatever Renata Cole knew, something told me it was going to matter far more than any 60-day clause I'd already found in that credit agreement. Renata Cole picked a coffee shop on Damon Avenue, one Julian's family would never set foot in, no marble counters, no baristas trained to pronounce affogato correctly, just a scarred wooden table by the window and a chalkboard menu that hadn't been updated since Christmas. She was already there when I arrived at 7:15 a.m., a manila folder pressed flat under both hands like she was afraid it might slide off the table on its own. "I quit in January because I couldn't keep signing off on the draw requests," she said before I'd even sat down. "I have a 2-year-old at home. I'm not going to prison for the Vance family." I ordered a coffee I didn't drink and let her talk. Renata had been the project accountant on Prairie Row for 11 months. Her job was simple on paper: track construction draws against actual work completed, confirm the numbers with the general contractor, and submit them to First Continental for release. What she found, starting around month 4, was that the draw requests Bartholomew submitted were consistently 18 to 22% higher than what the contractor's own progress reports showed. Draw 3 was supposed to cover framing and rough electrical on floors 1 through 9, she said, sliding a printed spreadsheet across the table. The contractor's invoice shows floors 1 through 6 actually framed. Bartholomew submitted for 9. That's $611,000 requested against work that was never done. I didn't touch the paper yet. Where did the extra money go? Some of it went to Dominic's LLC. You probably already found that, since you're the one who signs the bank paperwork. She said it flatly, not unkindly. But most of it went into an escrow account labeled contingency reserve that Bartholomew controls alone. No cosigner. Not you, not the bank, not the GC. Just him. I finally looked at the spreadsheet. Column after column, month after month, the pattern held. By her count, across 9 months, roughly $2.1 million had been drawn against work that didn't exist yet, funneled into an account with Bartholomew's name, and nobody else's on it. "Why give me this now?" I asked. "Because 2 weeks ago Bartholomew asked me to backdate 3 invoices to make draw 6 look clean before it goes out on the 28th, she said. I told him no. He told me accountants who ask too many questions don't last long in this business. I told him I'd already resigned, so it didn't matter what he thought of my future in it." She pushed a second document across, a text message screenshot, time-stamped, Bartholomew's name at the top. "Just adjust the March invoice dates to February 20th. Nobody checks that far back. This is how the business survives, Renata. Victoria doesn't need to know every detail." I read that last line twice. Victoria doesn't need to know every detail. For 5 years, I had assumed the worst thing Bartholomew was hiding from me was simple embarrassment. A man too proud to admit his son's wife was the only reason his company still had a heartbeat. Sitting in that coffee shop on Damon Avenue, I understood it was something else entirely. He wasn't just leaning on my guarantee. He was actively building a paper trail he needed me never to look at, because if I ever pulled the actual construction draws against the actual completed work, I would see exactly what Renata Cole had just shown me, a fraud running underneath the fraud I already knew about. "I'm going to need copies of everything," I said. "And I need you to be willing to talk to a bank examiner, if it comes to that." Renata slid the folder across the table without hesitation. I already made 3 sets. By the time I got to my office at Whitfield and Cross that morning, Marcus Webb had already called twice. I called him back from my private line, door closed. "Victoria, I have to ask, is everything all right at home?" His voice had the careful neutrality bankers use when they already suspect the answer. "Everything's fine, Marcus. I need to formally begin the 30-day termination notice on my personal guarantee for Vance Family Holdings and Vance Premier Properties. I'll have the written notice couriered to you by end of day." There was a pause on the line, papers shuffling. "You understand what this does to the Prairie Row draw schedule?" "I do. Draw 6 is scheduled for the 28th. If your guarantee terminates before that closes, our underwriting committee is going to want the entire facility remargined, and Vance Premier doesn't have the liquidity to remargin on its own. I've seen the financials. He hesitated. I probably shouldn't say that. You didn't say anything I don't already know, I said. One more thing, Marcus. If I send you documentation showing draw requests that don't match actual construction progress, what's the bank's obligation? Another pause, longer this time. That would trigger a fraud referral to our special assets group. Immediately. It wouldn't be a private matter between you and the family anymore. Understood, I said. I'll send the notice today. I didn't send him Renata's documents. Not yet. That was a card I intended to hold until I understood exactly how deep it went, and until I decided whether the man across the table from me at Sunday dinners, Julian, who still believed his father ran a legitimate business, deserved to fall alongside a father he might not even know was drowning in fraud. Julian noticed nothing different for the first 4 days. He kissed me goodbye each morning, made his usual jokes about my boring lawyer hours, and never once asked why I'd started coming home later, why I'd stopped attending Sunday dinner on Astor Street, why my phone buzzed constantly with messages from a number he didn't recognize, Renata's. On the 5th day, Eleanor called me directly for the first time in months. Victoria, darling, Bartholomew mentioned something odd. Something about the bank asking questions about your guarantee. Surely that's a misunderstanding. I kept my voice even. It's not a misunderstanding, Eleanor. I'm terminating it. I gave proper notice 5 days ago. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. You can't be serious, she finally said. Julian said, he said you'd never actually do anything. He said you were just upset about your father. I am upset about my father, I said. But that's not why I'm doing this. Then why? I thought about Renata's spreadsheet, sitting in a locked drawer in my home office. I thought about the text message, Victoria doesn't need to know every detail. I thought about 11 years of small sounds Eleanor made at dinner tables, the ones between a laugh and a sigh. Because Julian was right, I said. My money is mine. Which means it's also mine to take back. I hung up before she could respond. That night, I sat with the second document Renata had given me, one I hadn't fully absorbed until I read it alone, quiet, in my office with the door locked. It wasn't about Prairie Row. It was an internal memo from 18 months earlier, forwarded to Renata by mistake from Bartholomew's assistant, discussing a life insurance policy taken out on Arthur Sterling, my father, naming Vance Family Holdings as a contingent beneficiary through a business relationship neither my father nor I had ever agreed to or even known existed. My father's name. On a Vance family document. 18 months before his bank started calling about a lien nobody could explain. I read the memo 4 times before I let myself consider what it actually meant. Whatever Bartholomew had built underneath Prairie Row, it hadn't started with Prairie Row. And it hadn't stayed inside his own family. Day 10 arrived on a Tuesday, and it arrived loudly. I found out the way Julian found out, a phone call at 6:40 in the morning, Dominic's voice cracking through the speaker before Julian had even sat up in bed. They took the Porsche. There were 2 guys with a flatbed in the driveway. Mom's freaking out. Dad wants everyone at the house right now. Julian looked at me across the bed like I might have an explanation. I didn't offer one. I already knew exactly what had happened. Vance Premier Properties had missed a payment on a business line secured in part by Dominic's vehicle, one of several assets First Continental's risk team had flagged for review the moment my notice period officially triggered a covenant review. I'd read the notice provisions myself. I'd written some of the language myself, 5 years earlier, back when I still believed I was protecting a family instead of financing one. You have to fix this, Julian said, already pulling on yesterday's shirt. I'm not the one who missed the payment, Julian. You're the one who pulled your guarantee. I'm the one who gave 60 days notice, then honored a 30-day clause your father's own lawyer negotiated without reading it properly, I said. I didn't take anyone's car. A bank did that because the numbers stopped working the moment I stopped being the reason they worked. He stared at me the way you'd stare at a stranger who'd just told you something about your own house you didn't know. For 1 second, I almost told him everything, Renata, the spreadsheet, the memo about my father's name on a Vance beneficiary document. But I stopped myself. Julian wasn't ready to hear it, and more importantly, I wasn't ready to trust what he'd do with it. Go to your parents' house, I said. I have depositions. I did have depositions. What I didn't mention was that one of them was with a forensic accountant named Priya Anand, someone Whitfield and Cross had used on 3 prior fraud cases, someone I'd hired privately, off the firm's books, using my own money, for days earlier. Priya spent 2 hours going through Renata's documents in a conference room with the blinds drawn. When she finally looked up, she didn't look surprised so much as tired, the way people look when a pattern confirms something ugly they'd already half expected. This isn't sloppy bookkeeping, she said. This is a structured scheme. Whoever built this knew exactly how big to make each draw discrepancy, so it wouldn't trip an automatic review threshold at the bank. 18 to 22%, every time. That's not carelessness, that's calibration. Can you trace where the contingency reserve account actually sits? Already did. It's at a community bank in Wisconsin, opened under an entity called BEV Capital Partners. She slid a printout toward me. BEV, Bartholomew Edward Vance. He didn't even try very hard to hide it. I thought about the insurance memo. About my father's name sitting in a file that had nothing to do with him. I need you to check one more thing, I said, and gave her my father's full legal name, his date of birth, the approximate date the lien appeared on his hardware store's equipment. Priya was quiet for a long moment after I explained the connection. You think Bartholomew had something to do with your father's lien? I think it's possible my father's business trouble wasn't a coincidence, I said. I think it's possible someone needed my father in financial distress at exactly the moment it would push me to ask Julian for help, in front of the whole family, so that Julian's answer, and the family's reaction to it, would look like nothing more than an ordinary argument about money. Not a trigger. Priya didn't tell me I was being paranoid. She pulled out her laptop instead and started cross-referencing lien filings with the Cook County Recorder's database. It took her 3 days to find it. A UCC financing statement filed against Sterling Hardware and Supply, my father's business, 11 weeks before the bank called about the lien, filed by a debt purchasing firm called Redline Acquisitions LLC. Redline had bought a small, dormant equipment loan my father had taken out in 2019, and mostly repaid, then aggressively called the remaining balance due in full, triggering the lien. Redline Acquisitions LLC's registered agent, according to Illinois Secretary of State records, was the same law firm that had drafted Bartholomew's original personal guarantee modification 18 months earlier, the golf club Friends firm, the one that had missed what the 30-day clause meant for construction draws. It wasn't proof Bartholomew personally orchestrated it. Not the kind of proof that survives a courtroom, anyway. But it was more than coincidence, and I had spent 22 years learning the difference between a fact I could prove, and a fact I knew was true. Someone had manufactured pressure on my father's business, at almost exactly the moment it would force a confrontation at that dinner table. Someone had wanted Julian to say those words in front of everyone, so the family's abandonment of my father would feel justified, ordinary, deserved, instead of like the opening move in something much larger. I didn't know yet whether that someone was Bartholomew alone, or whether Julian had known more than he let on. What I knew was that the family that had spent 5 years calling my money, not really theirs, had, at some point, decided my father's business was worth sacrificing to keep their own fiction running a little longer. By day 15, Prairie Rose General Contractor filed a formal notice with the city after 2 consecutive draws came in short of payroll obligations. By day 18, First Continental's Special Assets Group opened a formal file, not because I'd sent them Renata's documents, which I still hadn't, but because their own internal audit, triggered automatically by my guarantee termination, had started finding the same discrepancies Priya found in half the time. Marcus Webb called me on day 19, his voice different than I'd ever heard it. Victoria, I need to ask you something directly, and I need an honest answer. Did you know about the draw irregularities before you sent your termination notice? I thought about Renata Cole's face in that coffee shop on Damon Avenue. About the memo with my father's name in it. About 22 years of learning exactly when silence protects you, and when it becomes its own kind of lie. Marcus, I said, I think you and I should meet in person. And I think you should bring someone from Special Assets with you. I have documents you're going to want to see before Draw 6 goes anywhere near approval. The line was quiet for a moment. Tomorrow morning, he said. My office. I hung up and sat alone in my home office for a long time, looking at the folder Renata had given me, the memo about my father, the UCC filing against Sterling Hardware and Supply. 18 days of the 30 had passed. Whatever was coming for the Vance family in the next 12 days, I understood now that it was never going to stop at broke. Somebody in that family had made my father collateral damage in a scheme to protect their own lie. And I intended to find out, by name, exactly who. Marcus Webb's conference room on the 14th floor of First Continental's LaSalle Street Tower had a view of the river, gray and flat under a March sky. 2 people from Special Assets sat across from me, a compliance officer named Sandra Reyes, and an outside forensic examiner the bank had brought in the moment their internal audit confirmed what Priya had already found. I laid out everything. Renata's spreadsheets. The BEV Capital Partners account in Wisconsin. The text message where Bartholomew told her Victoria doesn't need to know every detail. And last, the UCC filing against my father's business, filed by Redline Acquisitions LLC, registered to the same law firm that had drafted the guarantee modification that made all of this possible in the first place. Sandra Reyes didn't say much while she read. When she finished, she looked up and asked the only question that mattered. Are you prepared to have this go to the U.S. Attorney's Office, Mrs. Vance? Because at this volume, over this many months, this isn't a civil dispute anymore. I'm prepared, I said. I'd like it on the record that I brought this forward voluntarily, and that I have no personal financial interest in shielding anyone named in these documents. Understood. She made a note. Draw 6 will not be released. We're freezing all remaining disbursements on Prairie Row effective today, pending investigation. Given the scope of what you've shown us, I expect the bank will also be filing suspicious activity reports and pursuing recovery against all guarantors and beneficiaries of the contingency account. I nodded. 22 years of sitting across tables like this one, and it was the first time I felt something other than professional distance while doing it. Day 20 arrived without a phone call from Julian. It arrived instead as a headline in the Crane's Chicago Business Morning Brief, the kind of item that circulated fast among the people who mattered to Bartholomew's reputation. Prairie Row Development halted a mid-bank fraud investigation, developer Vance Premier Properties under federal review. By noon, Eleanor had called 4 times. I let all 4 go to voicemail. The 5th call, I answered. You did this, she said, no greeting, no pretense left in her voice at all. You destroyed us. I didn't file false draw requests against your husband's own contractor, Eleanor. I didn't put a lien on my own father's business to force a fight at a dinner table. I didn't open an account in Wisconsin to hide $2 million from a bank that trusted my signature. My voice stayed level. It had stayed level for 20 days, and I wasn't going to let it break now, not for her. I just stopped signing my name to something I didn't build. There was a long silence and then, quieter, what lien on your father's business? What are you talking about? I realized, listening to the genuine confusion in her voice, that Eleanor hadn't known. Whatever Bartholomew had orchestrated, he'd done it alone, or with someone else entirely, and in that moment, listening to a woman who had spent 11 years making me feel like an outsider in my own marriage suddenly sound frightened and lost, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not sympathy exactly. Recognition, maybe. She had built her entire identity on a foundation neither of us had actually been allowed to see clearly. Ask Bartholomew, I said, and ended the call. Day 25. Dominic's Delaware LLC surfaced in the Special Assets file, exactly as Renata had described it, 2 years of marketing consulting payments with no marketing ever produced, now flagged as a likely conduit for skimmed draw funds. Whether Dominic had known the full scope of what he was laundering or simply enjoyed a convenient arrangement without asking questions, I didn't know, and by that point, didn't especially care to find out. The bank's investigators would answer that question with more rigor than I had patience left to apply. Julian finally came to see me on day 27, at my office, not at home. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, which he probably hadn't. "They're going to take the house," he said. "Astor Street. The bank filed something with the county. Dad won't talk to me. Mom won't stop crying. Dominic's talking about leaving the country, which is insane, and I don't even know if he's joking." "I know," I said. "You knew this whole time. About the fraud. About my father." His voice cracked somewhere between accusation and disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because 5 days before you found out, you sat at your parents' table and told me my father's collapsing business was my problem, not yours." I kept my hands folded on the desk, still, the way I'd learned to hold them in front of hostile witnesses for 2 decades. "You didn't ask what was happening to him. You didn't ask if he was going to lose 60 years of family history over an $84,000 shortfall. You made a joke about my bonus instead." Julian didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that would have mattered. "I found out 3 weeks ago that your father may have manufactured the exact crisis that made you say those words," I continued. "I don't know if you knew. I genuinely don't. But I know you didn't ask, Julian. Not once in 5 years did you ask where the money for this life actually came from. You just assumed it would always be there because it always had been." "So this is punishment," he said. "For one sentence at a dinner table." "No," I said. "This is the natural conclusion of a family that spent 5 years pretending my signature didn't matter, until the day it stopped being there." Day 30 came on a Thursday. I hadn't planned to be present for it, but Julian asked me to meet him at the Vance Premier Properties office in Lincoln Park one last time, and some part of me, not forgiveness, something smaller and more practical than that, wanted to see it through to the end. The office had already been half emptied by the time I arrived. Bartholomew sat behind his desk in a room that no longer had its wall art, the outlines of removed frames still visible on the paint. Eleanor sat stiffly in a chair by the window, not looking at anyone. Dominic wasn't there at all. Word had reached me that morning that federal investigators wanted to speak with him about the LLC, and he'd retained a criminal attorney the day before. Bartholomew looked older than he had 5 weeks earlier, the confidence gone out of his posture the way air leaves a punctured tire, slowly, then all at once. "We have nothing," he said, not quite to me, not quite to the room. "The house is being seized next week. The accounts are frozen. I don't have money for groceries, Victoria. Do you understand that? I don't have money for groceries." I set my bag down on the one remaining chair, and didn't sit in it. "I found the UCC filing on my father's business, Bartholomew," I said. "Red Line Acquisitions. Filed through the same firm that wrote your guarantee modification. 11 weeks before the lien call. I'd like you to look at me and tell me that was a coincidence." He didn't look at me. That was answer enough. "Julian told me you always said the same thing to him growing up," I continued, quieter now. "That family takes care of family, and outsiders take care of themselves. I used to think that was just an old-fashioned kind of loyalty. I understand now it was never about loyalty at all. It was about who got to decide, in this family, whose problems counted." I picked my bag back up. "Your family, your problem, Bartholomew," I said. "Julian taught me that phrase. I'm just returning it to the person who actually meant it." I walked out of the office, past the empty spaces on the walls, past Eleanor, who still didn't look up, and into a hallway that smelled faintly of fresh paint from renovations the family would never get to finish. My father's business survived. Once I understood what had actually happened to his lien, unwinding it took 3 weeks, and one very direct letter from Whitfield and Cross to Red Line Acquisitions, citing the UCC filings timing alongside the discovery materials the bank had already turned over to federal investigators. Redline settled quietly rather than have its own paper trail examined in open court. Sterling Hardware and Supply reopened its doors on April 30th, 68 years after it first opened them, my father back behind the counter 3 mornings a week against his cardiologist's advice, and my repeated objections. Julian and I didn't divorce immediately. We didn't reconcile either. We existed for a few months in the strange, quiet space between two people who had built a life on assumptions neither of us had ever tested, waiting to see whether anything real remained once the assumptions were gone. In the end, and I use that phrase carefully now, the way I once avoided it in every closing argument I ever gave, because some endings really do simply arrive, we didn't find enough left to build on. The divorce was uncontested. Julian moved out in June. I still think, sometimes, about the version of that dinner where Julian says something different. Where he asks about my father instead of my bonus. I don't know if that version of him exists. I know the one who does exist learned, at 30 days' notice, exactly what it costs to assume someone else's signature will always be there to catch you. I kept my name. I kept my father's business open. And I kept the folder Renata Cole handed me in a coffee shop on Damon Avenue, because some proof is worth holding on to, not for revenge, which had already run its course by day 30, but as a reminder of exactly how much can be built on someone else's silence, and exactly how fast it can fall apart the moment that silence ends.